this. And John is retelling this story to another community, to another set of believers, another community of Christians who are starting to experience the persecutions that these disciples were afraid was going to come. The religious leaders, the Pharisees, they're starting to kind of rise to a political power. And on their rise to political power, they're starting to squash this movement or attempting to squash this movement. They're trying to shut up the new Christians. They're trying to throw them out of the synagogue, and they're even trying to kill them. And so the disciples, or these new Christians, they're starting to ask the same questions that the disciples were asking. And John is retelling this story to them. These disciples, or these new Christians, are starting to say, well, what do we do now? I mean, now that Jesus is gone, how do we know the way? And now that Jesus is gone, how do we know how to be faithful to all of his teachings in the midst of all of this persecution, as everything seems to be falling apart? How do we become faithful, or how do we remain faithful to this Jesus? They're the same questions that the disciples were asking. And I happen to believe that they're kind of the same questions that we ask. Think about it. The disciples, they knew that it was tough enough to follow Christ with Christ being there with them. They understood that it was difficult to follow his teachings. They didn't always know how to live. And you and I know that it's difficult to follow Christ, even now, because he's not here. We're like the early Christians and the disciples, because we would just much rather have Christ here with us. It would just be easier if Christ was just right here by our side, telling us how to live, showing us what we're to do. But the problem is he's not. And so we have to ask the same questions that the disciples would ask is, well, how do we know the way? And how do we remain faithful to him while he's gone? And think about it. You're in an environment almost every day. You go to school and are in an environment where it may not always be that comfortable to pray before a meal. It may not always be that comfortable to share your faith. It would be much easier to share your faith if Jesus was just by your side. I mean, here's Jesus. That's all you would have to do. But you're faced almost every single day with decisions that will determine whether or not you will be faithful to Christ. In those times when you're all by yourself, no one else is around, you can do whatever you want and no one would know. But it's in those moments where you have to decide, am I going to be faithful to Christ or am I not? And then there are those decisions where you have to decide, do I go to this party or do I not? Do I watch this movie or do I not? Should I make this joke or should I not? And even the decision of, do I date this person or do I not? It's in all those decisions where you're faced with, how do I know the way? How do I know how to live like Christ? How do I be faithful to Christ? It's in all of that you're faced with the same questions that the disciples and the early Christians were with. But we've tried to fix all of that. I mean, we've tried to make it a little easier for ourselves. We used to wear those WWJD bracelets. You guys remember those? Yeah, like everybody and their grandma had one of those bracelets. It started out as a witnessing tool, at least the way I remember it. It started out as a witnessing tool. I remember the first time I saw one, I asked someone what it was, and he says, "Oh, well, it stands for what would Jesus do?" And I try to live my life by what Jesus would do, and went into sharing the gospel with me. And at the end of his sharing, he found out I was a Christian, ended up giving me the bracelet and saying, "Well, here, go and kind of do likewise. If someone asks you what it means, share with them the gospel and talk with them about what it means to live like Christ." And so at first it was a witnessing tool. And after a while it became less and less a witnessing tool. More and more people had them. And it became more and more of like an individual reminder that in the midst of difficulties, when you need discernment, when you're trying to figure out how to be faithful to Christ, when you're trying to figure out the way that Christ would live, you were to look down at your wrist and say, what would Jesus do? But then it became less and less of like an individual reminder and more of a fashion statement. You started seeing people wear 20 of them on each arm. I mean, every color of the rainbow was represented, and you had patterns and all this other kind of stuff on the bracelets. And so it became less and less of an individual reminder and more of a fashion statement. And it became crazy because you started seeing people wear all kinds of them, and yet they lived as if nothing was different. You started seeing people wear them, and yet they were doing things that you know Christ would never do. And so we ended up no longer wearing them. Over time, it became less and less of a fashion statement, and it was already less of an individual reminder, and it was no longer a witnessing tool. And so over time, we just kind of took them off. We stopped looking at our wrists. Eventually, we took them off. And I think the reason why it never really had a dramatic impact on how we live, I think the reason why is because it never got rid of the problem. The problem is Jesus isn't here. And every time we had to ask the question, every time we had to look down at our wrists and ask the question, what would Jesus do? We were reminded that Jesus isn't here. And we were left with the question, what do we do? How do we know the way? How are we to remain faithful to Christ and all of his teaching when he's not here? We had the same question that the disciples and those early Christians had. But we also have the same answer that those disciples and those early Christians had. Let me read the passage to you one more time. It's in John chapter 14, starting at verse 15. And this is what the Lord says. If you love me, you will obey what I command. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another counselor to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. But I will not leave you as orphans, I will come to you. Before long, the world will not see me anymore, but you will see me. Because I live, you also will live. And on that day, you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. Whoever has my commands and obeys them, he is the one who loves me. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love him and show myself to him. So this answer that Jesus gives to his disciples, Jesus is essentially saying, he's basically saying that in the midst of all of this, that when you hear all of these persecutions and these troubles that are going to come, and when you're trying to figure out how to be faithful to me, when you're trying to figure out what is the way, I want you to love me. And I want you to love me by keeping my commands. But Jesus also goes a little farther, and he gives them a promise. He says, and I will ask my Father, and he will send you another counselor to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. When Jesus says, and he will send you another counselor, the word for counselor is literally translated as someone who comes alongside of you in times of need. Who, when you need help, this is the one, this counselor is the person who comes to you and gives you that help. And that's what Jesus was when he was with his disciples. He was the one who was there by their side, showing them how they're to live, telling them how they're to live. And in their times of need, he was the one who gave them help. But he says, I will ask my Father, and he will send you another counselor, meaning he's going to send you one just like me. This counselor, this Spirit that Jesus is talking about, he's someone who's just like him. He is the very person, the very Spirit of Christ himself, who's right here. But at the same time, this counselor is someone who's different than Christ.